A lot of survival advice sounds brilliant until someone actually tries it. And a few weeks ago, I found one of the most popular water purification hacks on the internet. According to countless videos, blogs, and comment sections, you could turn questionable water into something safe to drink using materials that cost less than $2. Cheap, simple, portable. The kind of trick people share with complete confidence. The problem? Almost nobody seemed to be testing whether it actually worked. So I decided to do exactly that. And by the end of this experiment, I wasn't asking whether the trick worked. I was asking whether it had actually made the water worse, because what happened surprised me far more than I expected. When most people think about water purification, they imagine expensive filters, complicated equipment, or emergency survival gear. But internet hacks promise something different. They promise shortcuts, a plastic bottle, some sand, some charcoal, maybe a coffee filter, maybe a piece of cloth. Depending on who you ask, that's apparently all you need to transform dirty water into clean drinking water. At least that's the claim. And honestly, it sounds believable. If you've ever seen survival shows, you've probably watched people build makeshift filters from natural materials. Water goes in, dirty, water comes out looking cleaner. Visually, it seems convincing. And that's exactly why so many people trust it. After all, if the water looks cleaner, doesn't that mean it is cleaner? Well, not necessarily. And that distinction would become the entire point of this experiment. Because clean-looking water and safe drinking water are not always the same thing. In fact, they're often completely different things. So before testing anything, I wanted to understand what this famous $2 trick was actually supposed to do. The version I found most often used, a plastic bottle cut in half. Inside were layers of cloth, charcoal, sand, and small stones. The idea was simple. Dirty water would pass through the layers. Large debris would get trapped. The charcoal would supposedly absorb impurities. The sand would catch smaller particles, and cleaner water would emerge from the bottom. Sounds reasonable. In theory, that's exactly how many filtration systems work. But theory and reality are very different things, especially when your drinking water is involved. So I gathered everything I needed: a bottle, charcoal, sand, gravel, cloth, and a few different samples of dirty water. Some contained visible dirt, some contained organic debris, and one sample looked almost clear even before filtering. That last sample would become very important later, because appearances can be incredibly deceptive. As I started assembling the filter, I felt cautiously optimistic. The design seemed logical, the materials were cheap, and millions of people online couldn't all be wrong, right? Then again, the internet has a long history of confidently spreading terrible advice. So, there was only one way to find out. Test it. I carefully layered the materials. Cloth at the bottom, then charcoal, then sand, then gravel. Everything looked surprisingly professional. Honestly, if you saw it sitting on a table, you'd probably assume it would work. And maybe that's part of the reason these hacks spread so easily. They look scientific. They look convincing. They look like real filtration systems. But looking like something and being something are very different things. Still, there was only one thing left to do: pour the water. The first sample was disgusting. Brown, cloudy, filled with visible particles. Exactly the kind of water you'd never want to drink. I slowly poured it into the filter and waited. The water trickled downward, through the gravel, through the sand, through the charcoal, and eventually began dripping into the collection container below. At first glance, the results looked incredible. Seriously. The difference was dramatic. The water emerging from the bottom was noticeably clearer. Not perfect, but far better than what went in. And this is the moment where most videos end. The creator holds up the cleaner-looking water. Everyone celebrates, experiment successful. But I wasn't finished, because looking cleaner wasn't the goal. Being safer was. And this is where things got interesting. I repeated the process with multiple samples. Each time, the visual transformation was impressive. Cloudy water became clear. Floating debris disappeared. Sediment levels dropped dramatically. If I judged the experiment using my eyes alone, I would have called it a success. No question. But then I started thinking about something. What exactly had been removed? And more importantly, what hadn't? The filter was obviously trapping larger particles. That much was easy to see. But bacteria? Viruses? Microscopic contaminants? Those aren't visible. You can't look at a glass of water and instantly know what's inside. And that's exactly why water purification is such a dangerous subject. The most dangerous water often looks completely normal. Then, something unexpected happened. I noticed tiny black particles appearing in the filtered water. At first, I thought it was dirt from the original sample. But after closer inspection, it wasn't. The charcoal itself was breaking apart. Pieces of the filtration material were ending up in the supposedly cleaner water. Not enough to create obvious danger by themselves, but enough to raise a very uncomfortable question. Was the filter introducing new contaminants while removing others? That wasn't what I expected, and it got stranger. The more water I ran through the system, the more inconsistent the results became. Some batches looked crystal clear. Others appeared slightly cloudy. Sometimes particles escaped. Sometimes they didn't. The performance wasn't stable. It varied constantly. And suddenly, the confidence I had at the beginning started disappearing. Because if the filter couldn't consistently remove visible particles, what chance did it have against contaminants you couldn't even see? That's when I tested the sample that looked clean before filtration. Remember that one? The water that already appeared fairly clear? This was the real challenge, because many dangerous contaminants don't affect appearance at all, and the result revealed something important. The filter barely changed the water. Visually, there was almost no difference, which highlighted a major flaw in the entire concept. The trick mainly improved appearance. It made dirty-looking water look cleaner, but water that already looked clean remained basically unchanged. And that's exactly the type of water people often trust the most. A mountain stream, a lake, a puddle after rain. Water can appear pristine while still containing harmful microorganisms. The filter wasn't giving us information about safety. It was giving us information about appearance. And those are not the same thing. In some ways, that might actually be more dangerous, because confidence can be risky. Imagine you're stranded somewhere. You build this filter. The water comes out clear. You feel reassured. You drink it, but the invisible threats remain. That's a scary possibility, especially because the clearer the water looked, the more convincing the illusion became. And this changes everything. Because suddenly, the biggest risk wasn't dirty water. It was false confidence. The experiment had started as a test of a cheap purification trick. Now it was becoming a lesson about how easily our brains can be fooled. We naturally trust what we can see. If something looks cleaner, we assume it's safer. If something looks professional, we assume it's effective. If enough people repeat a claim, we assume it's true. But none of those assumptions guarantee reality. By the time I finished testing, the conclusion was becoming clear. The filter absolutely did something. It wasn't completely useless. It removed debris. It reduced sediment. It improved clarity. Those are genuine improvements. But purification? That's a much bigger claim. And based on what I observed, the evidence simply wasn't there. At least not from this basic setup. In fact, under certain circumstances, the trick might create a dangerous misunderstanding. Because a person could see clearer water and assume the problem had been solved, when in reality, only part of the problem had been addressed. So did the $2 water purification trick work? The answer depends entirely on what you mean by work. If your goal is making dirty water look cleaner, then yes, it works surprisingly well. If your goal is removing large particles in sediment, then yes, again, it works. But if your goal is creating water that's genuinely safe to drink without additional treatment, that's a completely different story. And that's where the trick falls apart. Because filtration and purification are not interchangeable terms. They're related, but they're not identical. One can improve water, the other aims to make it safe. That's a huge difference. The most surprising part of this experiment wasn't that the trick had limitations. Every survival method has limitations. The surprise was how many people seemed unaware of those limitations. Online, the hack was often presented as a complete solution, a replacement for proper treatment, a miracle shortcut. And that's where things become dangerous, because shortcuts are incredibly attractive when you're dealing with emergencies. Nobody wants complicated answers. People want simple solutions. But nature doesn't care what answer is convenient. Contaminated water doesn't care how many views a video has. Reality remains reality. So here's my final verdict. As a pre-filter, useful. As a way to improve water clarity, absolutely. As a complete purification system, not even close. And in some situations, believing otherwise could make things worse than doing nothing at all. Because false confidence can push people into taking risks they otherwise wouldn't take. That's the real lesson here. Not every viral hack is fake. But not every viral hack tells the whole story either. Sometimes the most important part is the information that's missing. And in this case, what was missing mattered more than the trick itself. The next time you see a survival shortcut that promises incredible results for pocket change, ask a simple question. What exactly is it doing? And maybe more importantly, what isn't it doing? Because those unanswered questions are often where the truth hides. And honestly, that's why I love running experiments like this. Not because they always succeed, but because failure often teaches more than success ever could. The internet showed me a $2 solution. Reality showed me the fine print. And the difference between those two things turned out to be the entire story. Next time, I'm testing another survival claim that millions of people swear by. And after what happened here, I'm not assuming anything anymore.